So the goal of this presentation is to give you just a few principles for when you need to communicate data in some format. Even if the study you have chosen for your research presentation doesn't have a lot of data, I still want you to know a few principles for communicating them. So, 4 principles we're going to talk about today. Use sentence headlines. This should already be familiar, but I want to re-emphasize it. Getting rid of clutter. The main principle is to get rid of any ink that is not data, anything that is not contributing to the overall story of the data. I'd like you to sort to emphasize your story and use contrast. So let's go over the first of these, using sentence headlines. So if we look at a graph like this and a typical phrase headline, such as results, we really have to, the audience is going to be focused during your presentation on trying to understand this graph, even though it's a pretty simple graph. If we change this and we do a heading such as X versus Y, oranitine alone versus triple therapy, it still doesn't really tell us what we're supposed to learn from it. You should have a sentence heading that really emphasizes the bottom line, the main point, the main story of the graph. The main point of this graph is that triple therapy has lower recurrence. So, using a sentence headline such as triple therapy, reduced ulcer recurrence, really helps your audience focus on your main point, what you want to have them take away. Let's look at another example. So if we just have a phrase, it says levelized cost of selected technologies. Again, we have to really kind of work to figure out what the main point is. Instead, you might say geothermal has the lowest levelized cost. We're going to talk about how to improve all of these graphs in a moment. The main point I want to make first is just using that sentence heading. So something like this, just results, tells us nothing. Now, how we decide to do this sentence heading depends a little bit on our audience. So, for instance, if we say speed deviations decreased after the fog warning system was implemented, then we assume that our audience knows that decreasing speed deviations is a good thing. So this would work well for a technical audience or somebody who knows something a little bit about transportation. But if we have a more general audience who's maybe less knowledgeable, then the sentence heading might be something like this. The fog warning system produced safer road conditions by lowering speed deviations. So let me give you an example to figure out on your own. This is a cute graph from the dating website OkCupid, where they collect lots of analytics about their users. And so this graph is measuring people who use Twitter every day and the average length of their relationships by the age of the user. And they're comparing people who use Twitter every day, the blue line, versus everybody else, which is the gold line. So my question for you is, what should the headline be? So first of all, it should not be people use Twitter every day versus everybody else. That's not a story. That doesn't communicate the main idea. Instead, you might want to go something like this. Daily Twitter users, average shorter relationships. Now, oftentimes you'll have a graph that has more than one main story or main point you want your audience to take away. So a secondary point of this graph would be that relationship length increases with age. In this case, just say that. You don't need to write everything down. Your sentence heading should encapsulate the main point. So if they take away one thing from the slide, put it in a sentence and think about what is the main takeaway. It should be like a newspaper headline. You would never see a newspaper headline of Brazil versus Italy in the World Cup. Your newspaper headline would be Brazil defeats Italy 3-0 in the World Cup. So really think about what is the main story, the main outcome, the main takeaway that you want your audience to learn from your slide. So the next main principle here is to get rid of clutter. You've probably noticed some of the graphs, even with the sentence headline, are still pretty ugly, not very professional looking. So here's one. We have the sentence headline, but there's a lot of clutter. First of all, so think about what would you take away? First of all, since it's a presentation, I would take away the caption. In a paper, you absolutely need this caption, this figure 1 down here. In a presentation, you should be able to convey all this information verbally to your audience. Don't make them read it, and don't have that up there where it's going to detract from the main point. You really want your graph to stand out. So take away the caption. You have your sentence heading, so that captures. So you have the main point 2 ways in a sentence heading, in the graph, and then of course you'll be stating it. So that's 3 ways. Right? So first, take out the caption. Then really think, how can I simplify things? Do we really need, is your audience going to look at these data points? I would take them out, make them smooth lines. Take away the background. Take away those lines in the background. We don't need it. Take away boxes. Again, anything that is not communicating the story, that is not communicating your data, take away. Whoops. That caption came back there. So that we end up with something like this. If we compare these two, this is much cleaner, a much simpler story than this is, where there's a lot to distract your audience. Let's look at an example with a table. Again, first thing, I would take away this caption. Captions are important in a paper, but here, your audience is not going to get lost. You can communicate what's in the table yourself. Go ahead and take that away. Next, take away as many of the grid lines as possible. These just interfere, these lines here, just interfere with our ability to compare and contrast the numbers. So we change to something like this. So here's our before, and here's our after, much cleaner. Let me give you another example of a table. So here's a table with a lot of grid lines. Look how clean it looks if we just remove those grid lines. So when you have tables, really think about, do I need all those lines? They interfere, they distract from the eye, distract the eye from really seeing the numbers. They compete with the numbers. So go ahead and take them out. So my next principle here is to sort to emphasize the story. Don't just throw things up there. So for instance, here's a graph. Needs to be simplified. We have these 3D bars. Don't use 3D. Just use flat. Only use 3D if that third dimension means something. Don't use it as decoration. Get rid of the background. Get rid of the lines here. And also go ahead and sort this. This really helps tell the story. So now we can really clearly see that this has the lowest cost and this has the highest cost. Let me give you another example with the table. So here's the table on homicide rates by state that's sorted alphabetically. But if we want to know which state has the highest homicide rate, well, then we'd want to go ahead and sort it by increasing homicide rate here. You'll notice that I've also lined up the numbers so that there's the same number of digits. Here, they're aligned, they have different numbers of decimal points. It's really hard to tell the difference that 9 is bigger than 8.8 just by looking. Here, it's a lot easier to see, to compare some of the differences. Next and last point, use contrast to really emphasize the main point you want your audience to take away. So if I have this table on speed deviations we've seen a couple times, and I really want to emphasize that low speed deviation, I might put it in red. I might put a circle around it. Here's an example of the homicide rates. If I really want to focus on, look at how much higher these 3 southern states are than the rest, I can put them in a little box here. Here's another graph we haven't seen before, looking at graduation rates by gender and international status at a fictional university. You probably noticed this would be a little bit easier to read if these lines weren't competing with the data. Now, when you're doing a presentation, you could take a few liberties here. So say I really want to focus on the poor performance of U.S. men. I might do something like this. So put all these others in the same color, line them up rather than relying on the color to help us see which one goes with which, and put the one that I really want my audience to focus on in a different color to really make it stand out. So here are the 4 principles that I went over. In class, I'm going to give you 2 visualizations and ask you to suggest improvements to them. Here's the first one. So I'll give this to you in class. I will ask you to identify 5 things to change about this one. It should be no problem. And likewise with this. This one I might just ask you to identify 4 things you want to change with this one. But how would you change the slide? What would you do? And so this should be pretty straightforward. In class, I'll give you one or both of these slides and ask you to quickly note a couple changes that you want to make. I'll also give you a chance to ask any questions at the beginning of class before I give the open note quiz. Thank you.